Our next speaker is going to speak remotely. Is Christian List from Ludwig-Maximilian-Universität in Munich, and the field is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, let me do a sound check just to make sure that people can actually see me and hear me. Can I get some kind of visual cue? Okay, good, great. Okay, so I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to speak about consciousness and the objectivist worldview. I should note that there is a paper on which this talk is based, which has just recently been published, and the link is included on this slide, but I can also send people the paper if they write to me and would like to have a copy. Okay, so my aim is to defend the thesis that any attempt to explain how consciousness fits into the world faces a quadrilemma, or perhaps I should say tetralemma, depending on whether we are happy to mix Latin and Greek. So what does this quadrilemma consist in? Well, it consists in the fact that there are 4, at first sight, plausible claims that we might expect any satisfactory metaphysical or scientific theory of consciousness to respect, but which are mutually inconsistent. So it turns out that any theory can satisfy at most 3 of the 4 claims at once. And what I want to suggest is that this quadrilemma gives us a hopefully useful diagnosis of what exactly it is that makes it so hard to accommodate consciousness in an objectivist worldview. Okay, so here's the plan for my talk. I'll first introduce the 4 claims. Then I'll say a little bit about why I think they are at least initially plausible, although then on further reflection, we might wish to, in fact, we will have to reject at least one of them. I'll then explain why these 4 claims are mutually inconsistent, so why there is a quadrilemma, and then finally I turn to the escape route. So the quadrilemma has 4 horns, and so we are going to look at each of them. Okay, so let me begin with the 4 claims. Here they are. The first claim is first-person realism. This is the claim that for any conscious subject, there are first-personal facts. I'll say more about what this means in a moment. The second claim is non-solipsism. It's the claim that more than one conscious subject is real. The third claim is non-fragmentation. The totality of facts that hold in any given world are compossible. So worlds are coherent, not fragmented. And the fourth claim is that reality consists of one world, one objective world, you might say, not of many worlds. Okay, so let me say a little bit about why these 4 claims are at least initially plausible before then turning to the conflict between them. So let me begin with the first claim, which was first-person realism. Just to reiterate it, that's the claim that for any conscious subject, there are first-personal facts. Now, a widely recognized feature of phenomenal consciousness is its first-personal nature. My conscious experiences are first-person experiences that I have. You don't have my conscious experiences, you have yours. And consciousness doesn't seem to occur just out there in the world impersonally, but I am conscious, I have experiences, I have perceptions, feelings, sensations, and so on. So consciousness is really something that I first personally experience as a subject. It's not just the sort of mere third-personal, impersonal, detached happening in some objective world. Let me give you a few quotes to support this idea or this intuition, and I could have chosen more than those, but they are drawn from a variety of people ranging from analytic philosophy to phenomenology. So here, for instance, is David Chalmers. He says the task of a science of consciousness is to systematically integrate two key classes of data into a scientific framework. Third-person data, or data about behavior and brain processes, and first-person data, or data about subjective experience. This at least lends some plausibility to the idea that consciousness is associated with first-personal facts. Although it turns out that, strictly speaking, Chalmers himself is not committed to the thesis that I've called first-personal realism. A second author I want to quote is Thomas Nagel. So he speaks of conscious states as having essential subjectivity and as being essentially connected with a single point of view. And he further emphasizes the fact that I, or any self, and not just that body, am the subject of those states. Look, Nagel seems to quite explicitly recognize something like first-personal facts in the context of consciousness. Here's Lynn Rudder Baker. She says, naturalism takes the world to be impersonal. What exists are individuals and their properties, but none of these requires appeal to anything expressible in the first person. And then she suggests that such a worldview that she describes as naturalistic leaves out any subject's first-person perspective. In particular, she writes, how could a centerless world accommodate me? So a purely third-personal world. She suggests it couldn't if we take first-person facts to entail properties expressible only in the first person, or first-person properties, then there are irreducible first-person facts. So this is an explicit affirmation of some form of first-personal realism. And then finally, here's Dan Zahavi. So he writes, subjectivity is a built-in feature of experiential life. Experiential episodes are neither unconscious nor anonymous. Rather, they necessarily come with first-personal givenness or perspectival ownership. The what it is likeness of experience is essentially a what it is like for me-ness. So maybe a little bit flowery, but I think it does also convey this idea that something special about conscious experiences is that they're associated with first-personal facts. So I think these ideas lend some support to the claim that for any conscious subject, there are first-person facts, such as, in my case, the fact that I'm currently in a particular experiential state. And this first-person fact is different for me than for you. I mean, you are also in a particular experiential state that you experience from the first-person perspective, but yours is distinct from mine. I'm later going to discuss the opposing view, which denies the existence of first-person facts and which even denies the notion that there is a third-person, first-person distinction at the level of facts at all. I think that's actually the mainstream view in philosophy, but I think we have good reasons to take first-person facts seriously. Okay, so let me turn to the second thesis, which is non-solipsism. That's the thesis that more than one conscious subject is real. Hopefully, this should be very uncontroversial. I mean, I'll later mention one contribution to the literature that seems to deny this, but by and large, I think most people will accept non-solipsism because most people are likely to believe that they are not the only conscious subject. And I think it's very reasonable to expect a good theory of consciousness to vindicate this idea. Okay, so let me quickly move on to the third thesis, which was non-fragmentation. This is the thesis that the totality of facts that hold in any given world are compossible. Worlds are coherent. And I think that's also extremely uncontroversial. So if we think of a world, either the actual world or a possible world, as being populated by a body of facts, so for instance, we think of the world as being constituted by the totality of facts that hold in it, so broadly along the lines of Wittgenstein's famous thesis that the world is everything that is the case, which he then further clarifies by saying that the world is the totality of facts. So suppose we think of a world in this way, then basic necessary condition for the possibility of that world is that all those facts are compossible. So it must be possible for them to be simultaneously instantiated, namely to be instantiated at that world. A world that consists of mutually incompatible or non-compossible facts would be an incoherent and therefore not a possible world, let alone a candidate for being the actual world. Indeed, I think this thesis of non-fragmentation is really very deeply entrenched in logic, philosophy, and science, so much so that it's hardly ever even explicitly acknowledged as an assumption. And then fourthly, let me turn to one world. This is the thesis that reality consists of one world, not of many. Now, I think this is a central tenet of a standard scientific worldview, namely that reality consists of a single world, the actual world, which is shared by all of us, and of which science aspires to give us an objective picture. I think this very much sort of summarizes a key ambition of science in the Enlightenment tradition. It's very unusual and non-standard for a scientific or philosophical worldview to postulate that there are many distinct worlds, all of which are equally real, even if only one is actual for any subject. We find this idea virtually nowhere in the sciences, at most in some rather heterodox interpretations of quantum mechanics, most notably cubism, which actually separately I'm quite interested in. But it's fair to say that this is not an assumption shared by, for instance, mainstream physicists. And there are also a few philosophical arguments against one world, some of which I've cited here. I mean, you may think of David Lewis's modal realism prominently, which is, of course, one kind of challenge to the one world assumption, but then there are others out there. Goodman's pluriworldism is an early example. But I think it's fair to say that the one world picture is the mainstream one. So on the face of it, I think those four theses, first-person realism, so consciousness is associated with some first-person facts for each conscious subject, non-solipsism, there's more than one conscious subject, non-fragmentation, worlds are coherent, and then one world finally. That package of theses seems to be at first sight quite plausible. Now let me explain why these four claims are mutually inconsistent. I'll just give you a sort of a quick argument. I mean, there'll also be more technical ways of making the same point, but I hope that the quick argument conveys the basic idea. Suppose non-solipsism is true. So then more than one conscious subject is real. For each of these conscious subjects, according to first-person realism, there are first-person facts. This means there are first-person facts here from where I stand, but for each of you, there are also first-person facts from where you stand. But now the key point to note is that the totality of first-person facts for different conscious subjects are not compossible qua first-person facts. And I need to unpack this a little bit. Why is this the case? Now, if I'm in conscious state X and you are in conscious state Y, where X and Y are the complete conscious states that we're each in, then clearly I'm in conscious state X is a first-person fact for me from where I stand. And I'm in conscious state Y will be a first-person fact for you from where you stand. But these are not compossible qua first-person facts because they cannot be co-instantiated from a single point of view. We're distinct subjects with different perspectives on the world. Insofar as we occupy different perspectives on the world, it's not going to be simultaneously true from a single shared conscious perspective that I'm in conscious state X and I'm also in conscious state Y. X and Y are mutually exclusive conscious states. No single subject could be in those two states simultaneously. Now, of course, there are corresponding third-person facts of the form Christian is in conscious state X and Christian's interlocutor is in conscious state Y, and these are perfectly compossible. What is also perfectly compossible is a sort of relativized statement of the form, relative to Christian's perspective, it's true to say I'm in conscious state X, and relative to the perspective of Christian's interlocutor, it's true to say I'm in conscious state Y. So those constructions of the form, relative to such and such perspective, such and such holds, those are also compossible. But those are not the same as the original first-personal facts of the form I'm in conscious state X simpliciter, or I'm in conscious state Y simpliciter. Or I'm in conscious state X simpliciter is not to be confused with relative to Christian's perspective, I'm in conscious state X, because that relativized construction, this sort of third-personalized counterpart of the first-personal fact, that's of course true independently of the conscious perspective that you occupy. If we accept first-person realism, we mustn't confuse the first-person fact that I'm in conscious state X with the third-person fact that Christian is in conscious state X, or that relative to Christian's perspective, it's true to say I'm in conscious state X. First-person realism would precisely assert that those are distinct. You can reject this, needless to say, by denying first-person realism, but at the moment we are running with first-person realism for the sake of argument. It's also worth noting that a first-person fact is essentially subjective in the sense that it is not invariant under all shifts in the subjective perspective from which it holds. So first-person and third-person facts are not the same because only the former but not the latter have this essential subjectivity. So this is one way to see why I'm in conscious state X is not to be confused with Christian is in conscious state X, or also that's why I'm in conscious state X is not to be confused with relative to Christian's perspective, it's true to say that I'm in conscious state X. Okay, so I hope it's clear that the first-person facts of distinct conscious subjects are not generally compossible qua first-person facts. Only their third-personalized counterparts are compossible. Now, if, as just assumed, two or more conscious subjects are real, following non-solipsism, and each of them has these real first-person facts, and those first-person facts are not compossible, as I've just argued, it follows that either non-fragmentation is false, and the world subsumes those non-compossible facts. So the world, in effect, would be some kind of incoherent collection of facts, where portions of it are coherent, but globally we don't have coherence because the first-person facts across different equally real conscious subjects would not be compossible qua first-person facts. Or alternatively, the claim of one world must be false, and there are many worlds, namely something like one subjective world for each conscious subject, rather than just a single objective world. If we had many such subjective worlds, then each of these subjective worlds could, of course, be perfectly coherent. It would not be internally fragmented, but we'd have to reject the sort of traditional view that the world and reality are synonymous. Reality would not be exhausted by a single objective world, but would consist of a multiplicity of distinct subjective worlds that are in some sense real. The bottom line is then that these claims cannot be true together. Okay, let me now turn to escape rules. We've seen that we've got 4 mutually inconsistent claims, and what I want to show you now is that indeed any 3 of them are mutually consistent, and that then gives us ultimately 4 distinct horns of this quadrilemma, and we are faced with a choice on where we want to position ourselves. The first escape route from the quadrilemma is to give up first-person realism. And arguably, this is the most common response that you find, at least in mainstream analytic philosophy of consciousness. This is basically the denial that there are first-person facts at all. And this response would insist that the first versus third-person distinction is to be drawn not at the level of facts, but only at the level of language or the level of cognitive representation. According to this view, there can be different modes of presentation of certain facts, such as first-personal versus third-personal modes of presentation. And these correspond to different ways of linguistically describing the facts that are being presented, but crucially, the facts themselves are the same. According to this response, even though there is a difference in language or representation, whether I say Christian is in conscious state X or I'm in conscious state X, these are just different ways of speaking about or describing or linguistically picking out what is underlyingly the same worldly fact. Now, if we think that facts are always impersonal or aperspectival, then there's clearly no problem at all in embracing the view that the totality of facts about different subjects' conscious states can be co-instantiated in a single, objective, and non-fragmented world, even for lots and lots of different conscious subjects. And I think standard theories in the analytic philosophy of consciousness are committed to this view. I think that's totally obvious in the case of physicalist views, regardless of whether we focus on the reductive or non-reductive versions of physicalism. But it also applies to dualist views, regardless of whether we focus on the traditional Cartesian dualism or the more recent David Sharma style naturalistic forms of dualism. And I think it also applies to the various recently influential double aspect or Russellian monist views. Why is this? I think this is because one often overlooked commonality among all of these views in the mainstream philosophy of consciousness is that they assume that there is a single objective and non-fragmented world in which certain properties are instantiated. Well, some of those properties count as fundamental, while others count as derived. And all of these different metaphysical theories try to give us an inventory of those properties. The differences between the theories and what the debates are usually about lie only in the details of this inventory. For instance, they debate, which properties are fundamental, which are derived. Is it sufficient to postulate one kind of fundamental property and everything else is supervenient on properties of that first kind, or do we need to postulate two distinct kinds of fundamental properties, and exactly what are the fundamental properties, and so on and so on. So that's the natural way in which the disagreements are presented and framed. But nonetheless, there is this common assumption of a single objective and non-fragmented world, which then commits those views to the denial of first-person realism. There aren't first-person facts corresponding to each conscious subject, but there are merely first-person modes of presentation. Now, all of those theories, with the exception of the small category of illusionist theories, say that they are realist with respect to consciousness, but I think it's still worth pointing out that by denying first-person realism, they are committed to a form of anti-realism about first-personal facts. And then one can debate whether this is a feature or a bug. Let me now turn to the next response to the quadrilemma, which is to give up non-solipsism. This is essentially what Caspar Hare does in his so-called egocentric presentist theory. According to this theory, I, as a conscious subject, live in my own subject world, which Hare defines as a world in which there are functionally sentient creatures, the experiences of one and only one of which have the monadic property of being present. And I take it that those experiences that have the monadic property of being present are associated with first-person facts that hold for me, such as I'm having those experiences. In my subject world, there are other sentient creatures in a purely functionalist sense, but crucially, their conscious experiences are not present. Hare writes, an egocentric presentist believes that only one subject world exists. There are no other subject worlds. According to this position, it may be true in my subject world that I'm not the only one in pain and that other sentient beings can be said to be in pain too, where this is understood in a purely third-personal and functionalist sense. So he's certainly okay with giving an account of this language of mental state ascriptions to others, including experiential ascriptions to others. But Hare writes, for an egocentric presentist, the situations are not symmetrical. It's not that my pain is present to me and his pain present to him. Rather, mine is present and his is absent. I think you clearly get the sort of solipsistic vibe of this theory. In fact, Hare recognizes the solipsistic character of this theory. So here's a quote where he fully embraces this. He comments about how things were before he was born, writing, "Isn't it amazing and weird that for millions of years, generation after generation of sentient creatures came into being and died, and all the while there was this absence. That is, no conscious experiences were ever first-personally present. And then one creature, Caspar Hare, unexceptional in all physical and psychological respects, came into being, and pow, suddenly there were present experiences." Okay, so I think that's sort of enough about solipsism. Let me move on to the third possible response, which is to give up non-fragmentation. This third strategy to avoid the quadrilemma is to permit that a world, whether actual or possible, may consist of non-compossible facts. Worlds are in effect fragmented. A world could then be such that only some proper subsets of the facts populating it, fragments of that world, can be jointly instantiated. We've got this incoherent totality with some coherent fragments inside it. Kit Fine, in fact, describes, without endorsing it, a theory along these lines, which he simply calls first-personal realism. He doesn't endorse it because he is sort of agnostic on whether we should be first-personal realists, but he does suggest that if we were first-personal realists, then this would be the theoretical route he would recommend adopting. He writes, "The first-personal realist believes that there are distinctively first-personal facts. Reality is not exhausted by the objective or impersonal facts, but also includes facts that reflect a first-person point of view. He recognizes that if reality includes such first-personal facts for more than one subject, then reality must be fragmented." And I think this is against the implicit background assumption that reality and the world are synonymous. So he doesn't explicitly consider something like the thesis of one world, and so therefore he also doesn't explore whether that thesis could be denied. And what is clear is that against the background assumption that reality and the world are synonymous, if we accept first-person realism and we also accept non-solipsism, then we are forced to accept this form of fragmentation. And this point is clearly recognized in Fine's paper. Under the widely held assumption that reality consists of only one world, Fine's theory becomes what Fine himself calls fragmentalist. But of course, as I already mentioned earlier on, non-fragmentation is a key tenet of the standard assumption of, or standard understanding of what a world is, both in metaphysics and in logic. And postulating fragmented worlds would require a significant revision of the way we think about worlds in philosophy, logic, and scientific modeling. This is not to say that this route is impossible to pursue. After all, in some recent philosophical works, we have sophisticated theories of impossible worlds, for instance, and there are also some mathematical frameworks that one can try to adapt to make sense of this idea of fragmentation. So basically this idea that worlds are incoherent totalities, but with only coherent fragments. But it would be quite a revisionary move, which would also require the revision of many other bits of the philosophical, logical, scientific machinery that we use elsewhere. And so before we take that route, we should, at the very least, weigh the costs and benefits against those of the alternatives. This takes me then to the final possible response to the quadrilemma, which is to give up one world. And this is clearly the fourth route. Now, to sketch the basic idea, it's helpful to recall Caspar Hare's egocentric presentism, because I think the position can be nicely introduced by reference to Hare's position and then by indicating where it departs from Hare's view. One can think of Hare's egocentric presentism, or the solipsist position, as combining the thesis that each conscious subject has their own subject world with some form of fictionalism about the subject worlds of others. Hare is absolutely clear that only one subject world is real, mine, and there are no other subject worlds. I gave you the quotes. He nonetheless does recognize that for the purposes of some formal analysis, we might want to talk about other subject worlds as sort of technical constructs. So maybe there could be fictions for the purposes of formal semantics or something like this, but they're not given any reality status. So that's why I think it's fair to describe Hare's version of solipsism as a combination of those two theses that I've labeled A and B here. Now, the combination of those two theses is fully consistent with the idea that there is a single non-fragmented world, namely my own subject worlds. So the very moment I think that I'm the only real conscious subject, I can embrace first-person facts, and the totality of all facts that hold from where I stand will be a coherent totality. This can be my subjective world. This can be my first-personally centered world. It's the only one. So we still have one world, and we have non-fragmentation, but we have abandoned non-solipsism. I think we can avoid this theory, solipsism, and still retain non-fragmentation if we accept a version of the first thesis, namely that each conscious subject has their own subject world, while replacing the second thesis, fictionalism about the subject worlds of others, with a form of realism about the subject worlds of others. This would be a special kind of modal realism, but about the subjective worlds of others. This would require us to postulate many different subjective worlds, namely one for each conscious subject. And what I have labeled the many worlds theory of consciousness, or perhaps we could also call it the many centered worlds theory of consciousness, does precisely this. It does not assume that the first person facts associated with different subjects' conscious experiences hold at one and the same world, but rather it associates different subjects with different first-personally centered worlds, which coincide with respect to all third-personal facts, but differ with respect to some first-personal facts. This embraces a special form of modal realism, according to which different subjects' first-personally centered worlds are all real, but only one of them is present for each subject. Perhaps it's also worth noting that this picture does not force us to abandon the idea of an objective world altogether, because we could still say that the equivalence class consisting of first-personally centered worlds that are third-personally equivalent, so that coincide with all third-personal facts, can be labeled the objective world. So then the notion of an objective world would be an abstraction that is derived from first-personally centered worlds, but relative to this equivalence relation of third-personal equivalence. Now, in an earlier paper published in 2023 titled The Many Worlds Theory of Consciousness, I have suggested that the formal framework of centered worlds can be neatly adapted to represent first-personally centered worlds as ordered pairs consisting of what we would call third-personal worlds and loci of subjectivity, but I'll skip the technical details here because my aim today is not so much to defend this many-centered worlds theory of consciousness, but rather to present this broader quadrilemma. Let me conclude. I've argued that no theory of consciousness can simultaneously respect first-person realism, non-solipsism, non-fragmentation, and one world. And we obviously get very different accounts of how consciousness fits into the world, depending on which of the four claims we give up. The quadrilemma is then also relevant to the question of what a scientific explanation of consciousness could look like. It will make a difference to the structure of such an explanation in the recently emerging and growing science of consciousness, how we answer the following four questions. Question one, does the explanandum, so the thing we want to explain, include some first-personal facts for every conscious mind? Question two, are there other conscious minds? Or just myself? Question three, is the world internally coherent as opposed to internally fragmented? And question four, is there one objective world as opposed to several subjective ones? And I think what the quadrilemma shows is that giving a yes answer simultaneously to all four questions is incoherent. And then depending on which of the four questions we answer in the affirmative and which in the negative, we are likely to arrive at different approaches to accommodating consciousness within a scientific worldview. Thank you very much.